Hi there and welcome to the tutoring video from me, the History Tutor. And in this video we're going to look at AQA topic on Elizabethan England, and we're going to look at the topic of poverty, and we're going to work through a write an account question. Okay, so poverty is maybe not everyone's favourite topic, but really important to revise it. It appears in the exam very regularly. And then in combination, not everyone's favourite question is the write an account question. So we're going to combine the two together for a perfect storm of a great answer and work through your skills. So look at my revision guide, find the poverty pages and start to revise your knowledge. And we're going to go to quick quiz, and then we're going to work through how to do a write an account question on poverty. Okay, so here are 10 quiz questions about poverty. So have a look at the poverty pages in the revision guide, or have a look at my poverty revision talk through if you do not have my revision guide, and work out the answers. So pause me now and give it a go. Okay, so here are the answers. So what was a pauper? Well, this is somebody that was so poor they needed charity or to beg. So they're essentially a very poor person. List 2 reasons why unemployment is increasing in this era. So going back in time, Henry VII had banned sort of private armies of lords, or lords to have lots and lots of servants that could turn into private armies that then could carry on the War of the Roses against him. Also, enclosure of land and sheep farming led to fewer labourers were needed. So a sheep obviously needs a couple of people to look after it maybe, whereas a field could have lots of strips to farm and could be work for maybe 10 people. So if you just need a shepherd rather than 10 farmers, you've now got 9 people unemployed. Henry VIII also closed monasteries, so there were no monks and all the people who worked in monasteries. And also, monasteries often provided the care and charity for unemployed people or for beggars and paupers. So clearly the Christian church system of helping the poor has also disappeared and gone. So lots and lots of problems now around poverty. Question number 3, how much did population rise in Elizabethan times? So the population is now increasing back up to the Black Death population. So England's getting quite crowded and there's maybe not enough land for people to farm on. So population has risen up to 4 million. What was the Tudor structure society called, with the nobles rich, the poor, and then the sort of animals, the sort of general sort of structure? That's called the Great Chain of Being. Now that's important to consider because it is the duty of the rich to look after the poor in the Great Chain of Being. And we'll talk about how that works in a moment. So Thomas Harman's 1567 book said that there were 3 types of undeserving poor. What were they? So we had the counterfeit crank, who would maybe be a cheat and pretending to be ill, the bare-tops trickster who might get you into an awkward situation and then you get robbed and attacked, and the clapper dudgeon as well. So what did the 1531 poor laws lead to? So we've got the beggar licenses and whipping for illegal beggars. Then if you're turning up again and causing problems, you might get a hole in your ear to show that you've been caught a second time begging in the wrong place. Caught a third time, you might be executed. So a pretty harsh law in 1531 by Henry VIII. So how do things progress as we get in Elizabeth's time? Now, Elizabeth starts to be developing more welfare. So it's important to be recognising what the law was before Elizabeth, where a beggar is expected to go back to their hometown. If they don't, they could be executed eventually. And Elizabeth keen to develop a law that's maybe more supportive than that. So in 1576, a law was set up called the Act for Setting People to Work. So poor people are not going to be executed, they're going to be given a job and some work. Which place helped to set an example of how care for the poor should be set up, with a survey of the idle and unfortunate, and then care given to the unfortunate and work was given to the idle. So Thomas Harman's book set up this idea of idle people and undeserving as criminals. So there was an idea of making those people go to work. Whereas there's unfortunately poor who want to work but just can't work, and obviously they need charity and help. And Norwich led the way with this. And Norwich is an important place because it's essentially the second biggest city at this time. Due to trade with the continent, Norwich is really a centre of the wool trade, with lots of people going there to beg and looking for help. So when did Elizabeth bring in her own poor law that brought in all the ideas from Norwich and York and Ipswich that are covered in our notes? That's 1601. And what did Elizabeth Poor Law do? She raised a poor rate, a tax for the rich to help pay for the poor. So this is the idea of welfare coming in now in England. A welfare state is being set up to some extent. So deserving poor are given aid and help, whereas the idle poor sent to work, maybe either an apprentice or early versions of workhouses, and they are expected to work. So here is our question, and the question says, write an account of how the problem of poverty affected Elizabethan England. And the write an account question is a tricky one. Students do find it difficult to know exactly what to do. So let's have a think about what a success criteria should be for this. What do you think is in the mark scheme? Now, you should be able to work this out to some extent by looking at the wording of the question. Write an account gives you a clue, although we're not writing a story, so have a think carefully about that. And obviously, it's got phrases like Elizabethan England. It's 8 marks. So have a think. What do you think are the key aspects and key skills you need to show? So you can list these ideas in your revision guide and then come back to me for some other ideas as well. Okay, so here's what I think are the key things you'd think about. Well, firstly, write an account. You should really think about this still as an explain question, and explain using your P and P or paragraph still. We're not really going to be writing a story, although, as I say in point number 2, we are going to be talking about example and then consequence. So this is the nature of the write an account question. We are going to be giving an event and then talking about a consequence for Elizabethan England. So a poverty event, part of the poverty laws maybe, and then its consequence. We're going to do this twice. We're going to explain 2 sort of poverty problems and then explain a consequence for 6 marks. And if we can do some wider thinking, maybe about the impact on poor people and then how that impacts rich people, maybe we can then do some extra wide thinking for the 7 to 8 mark bracket. Okay, so let's do some planning for this now. So let's think about some examples of poverty as a problem, perhaps, and then think about the consequences. So we might need to think about then, as a consequence, what people do to help solve the problem. All right, and then the people might be the rich, gentry, the government. You might need to think about different sets of people. Think about some problems, maybe unemployment, maybe people not trusting poor people and the begging. Start thinking about some of the problems and then think about the consequences of them. Okay, so pause me now and have a think of some ideas. Okay, so here's what I've got. I've got unemployment and poverty were obviously a big problem caused by enclosure, overpopulation, inflation, etc. There's a lot of poverty around. And the consequence is that the rich were unhappy at the increasing cost of care for the poor. We start to get the poor rate and taxes coming in. The justice, the peace are going around collecting all this, and they're funding things like hospitals or even early workhouses, particularly if you're looking at places like Norwich and Ipswich and York, where they start to be more proactive in this. We've also got Harman's book started to label poor people as cheats and criminals and idle and lazy. So people started to worry about this. So the rich and gentry did not want to pay poor rate to give charity and money to cheats. So we got a little bit of a breakdown of the great chain of being here. The rich are not wanting to care for the poor. So the local councils have to start to do something about this. So in places like Norwich, they started to set up the Poor to Work programme. And by 1601, they had houses of corrections to put these idle poor to use. And then finally, we've got poverty was also punished as nobles and gentry thought it was laziness. So as we talked about with Henry VIII's laws, eventually could be executed after the 3rd time of being caught. So the 1601 Poor Law provided a system of help and welfare. Able-bodied and deserving poor were given help to ensure they could be useful to society rather than executed, for instance. Okay, so how are we going to write this? So we're going to still do our appeal paragraphs. We're going to say one problem poverty caused for Elizabethan England was nobles and gentry got upset having to pay more money, maybe. Give some evidence of this problem and then explain how this was a problem for Elizabethan England. Think about different groups of people and how they're reacting. So you can do one group in your explain and a different set of people in your furthermore, or maybe you can do a short-term idea in your explain and in your furthermore do maybe a longer-term impact. So you're thinking about different people or different places or different times even. Okay, so let's start writing this then, shall we? In your revision guide, find you the answer and you can start writing along with me your ideas. Doesn't matter if it's slightly different. The whole point is you're trying to create an argument. So let's make our argument, our first one then. So we're going to make a point. So one way that poverty caused problems in Elizabethan England was that, okay, and let's think about our first part of the plan was about poverty and unemployment. Maybe we could do that as a paragraph. Away you go, make your opening point. Okay, so I've said one way that poverty caused problems for Elizabethan England was that there was too much poverty and unemployment for the great chain of being to solve. It became a crisis of the great chain of being. So what would be a good example then to show this crisis and problem? So think now about some evidence about unemployment and poverty to put in. Away you go. So I've put, for example, due to large population rises, with London rising to a population of 200,000, which is pretty remarkable for that time, and poverty caused by enclosure and increasing inflation. All right, so I've given some examples there that people are really starting to struggle. So now explain this affected Elizabethan England because, and think about how the gentry and nobility are reacting. Okay, pause me now and come up with your idea. Okay, so I said this affected Elizabethan England because the gentry and nobility weren't happy at the increasing costs of supporting the poor. Places like London, they set up the Bedlam Hospital for the poor with taxes to pay for it. So obviously they didn't like that at all. Then think about furthermore, other places like Norwich, maybe, or Ipswich or York. Think about other places. How did they react? How do people there? What do they think about it all? Okay, explain another idea. Away you go. Okay, so I've said about Norwich. So furthermore, other places like Norwich, perhaps inspired by Harman's book about the trickster and Tom o' Bedlam, started to worry about the idle poor, started to use the poor rate to set the poor to work in the 1570s. This meant the poor were being punished for poverty and housing correction developed, rather than charitable help as per the Great Chain of Being. So they're being put in a prison for the poor, and the Great Chain of Being has sort of failed. You could talk about how monasteries have disappeared if you wanted to, in terms of that idea as well. Now, over to you then. Let's come up with another idea. So all by yourself now, without the sort of help sentence by sentence, come up with an argument about another problem of poverty. So you could talk about how poverty care was not good enough and poor people weren't being cared for well enough as an idea. We talked about that in a plan earlier. That might be a useful thing to consider. So pause me now and come up with your own paragraph. So I've said another way that poverty caused problems for Elizabethan England was that the nobility and gentry, due to their role in the Great Chain of Being, thought that poverty care was unacceptable. For example, at the start of Elizabeth's reign, the poor were still subject to the 1531 law that they sent them back to their hometown and would execute any poor that refused to go home. So this caused problems for Elizabethan England because the gentry nobility thought this was unfair and started to organise support to help the poor to work with the 1576 Act for setting the poor to work. Then in 1601, a poor law was set up. This led to workhouses to make the poor contribute and work hard rather than execution. This changed Elizabethan England as the poor contributed, but the wealthy had to pay more money for it in taxes. Furthermore, the Puritans felt that religious care was not acceptable, and they started to build almshouses to care for the poor rather than punish them as part of the Great Chain of Being. It was obviously their job that the nobles should look after them. For example, Lord Burleigh built an almshouse to care for 12 local people in poverty in the area near his Burleigh estate. Okay, so hopefully it gives you an idea of sort of changing roles. A problem of poverty, people felt what they weren't being cared for fairly, they're being executed unfairly, and they started to solve the problem by doing more action to help. Okay, well, I hope you found that useful and you've managed to revise your knowledge on poverty, but also practice that tricky write an account question. But if you did find it useful, I've got lots more help in my revision guide. You can see a picture of it here. So I have more videos in there. I've got pages you can work through as I talk you through how to answer questions. I've got simple notes, forms you can revise from by just simply reading through the bullet points and finding out all the information you need. I've got also talk through videos where I talk through all the content for you. So loads of help for you in this revision guide. Just simply look at the information for this video and you'll find a link to my Amazon pages. But also I have lots of free help. So do subscribe and I'll have more and more videos you can look at to help you develop your skills. I hope to see you again soon. Bye bye for now.